Well, today we're going to talk about the history, the vision and mission of World Indigenous Missions, as well as the core values of WIM. I will begin with the history of World Indigenous Missions, so you get an idea of just who we are, where we came from, and what we're all about. How we developed into the organization that we are now. But World Indigenous Missions was born in the fires of revival down in central Mexico, working with the indigenous peoples of those areas. And the first WIM missionaries spent much of their time preaching and teaching the gospel and establishing churches and training leaders in small villages. Is where we really were working at the time. And this was back in the 1970s, the early 70s. We weren't WIM at that time, but those were the ones who actually started World Indigenous Missions. We didn't become an organization until 1981 officially, and then in 1982 is when we received our first missionaries, WIM missionaries. And at that time, we only worked in Mexico. But in 1984, WIM began to expand into other areas. We first went to Spain out of Mexico. Then some of the Mexican missionaries went to West Germany. Then we moved to the Philippines, Bolivia, Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, France, Russia, Hungary, Romania, Indonesia, Thailand, China, and then several countries in Africa. We've had over 100 missionaries come through World Indigenous. Well, we have about 120 now missionaries with World Indigenous Missions, and we're not living in all those countries I just named. We're living in about 7 or 8 countries right now and working in others out of those countries. We've been able to train scores of missionaries, and they've planted several hundred churches. They've won thousands of people to the Lord, and it's just been a wonderful, wonderful thing that God has done in the last 30 years. We've also established a daughter organization called Southeast Asia Mission Teams, and it's located in the Philippines. And what they do is they work with third world countries, and they do very much what WIM does. They train them and send them into Thailand, into Vietnam, into other areas to start churches, to evangelize, and to train leaders. So we're very thankful for CMIST is what we call them, Southeast Asia Mission Teams. Well, let's talk a little bit about the birth of World Indigenous Missions. In the mid-1960s, Myron Anderson, who later became the founder and the president of World Indigenous Missions, began working in Mexico with an organization called Missionary Revival Crusade. MRC, Missionary Revival Crusade, actually worked in the cities at that time. But Myron had a desire and a vision to reach out into the small villages and to share the gospel in those areas where there were no churches. And during that time, these missionaries preached the gospel with much zeal, much sacrifice. It was hard doing what they were doing. And they would go into an area and they would preach the gospel. Then they would give food and clothing to the poor. They would build church buildings. And they would take their own money that they had raised to do this, and also to pay the salaries of pastors that they had raised up. So they provided the funds of all the people that they were ministering to at that time. They even had their own Bible college where they trained young pastors. And then these pastors eventually became the pastors of the churches there in the villages, the Mexican villages. This resulted in a great outpouring of the Holy Spirit. Lots of people were saved. Many churches were planted. And for a time, it seemed like everything was prospering. And it seemed like everything was going well. Because there was a great outpouring of the Holy Spirit. But Myron and the other missionaries began to realize that all the people, all the churches were dependent upon them. As long as they provided the money, as long as they came out and preached, as long as they built the buildings, the church went well. But if they backed off or if they went to the United States for any reason, things began to go downhill. And because of all that hard work, Myron's health really was adversely affected. And he saw that he couldn't keep up this pace. He couldn't continue to do what he was doing. So he returned to the United States really to reevaluate his ministry. Because he saw that once he left Mexico, everything that he had worked for the last 10, 20 years would be for naught. He was quite discouraged during that time. And he began to seek the Lord. And in God's providence, someone put a book entitled Behind the Ranges into the hands of Myron Anderson. It's a book written by J.O. Frazier, a missionary to China who began to use indigenous principles there in China. And Myron and some of the other people working with him saw that the villages that this missionary to China was working in was very, very much like the rural villages of Mexico. And their work was prospering. And the churches were becoming self-supporting. The churches were self-governing. They were evangelizing other people and establishing other churches. And they saw that the indigenous works there in China, those principles were working. So they began to pray about, what they should do and how could they apply this there in Mexico. About that time, Paul Kohler, another leader who worked along with Myron Anderson, he came across a book called Missionary Methods, St. Paul's or Ours by Roland Allen. And I believe that you'll have the opportunity to read that book. But he studied the writings of Allen, of Melvin Hodges, of Donald McGavran, and others who were writing about indigenous principles. And he and Myron got together and they decided, hey, let's do this. Let's do this in Mexico. So they went into an area right around Ciudad Valles, Monte, Tamazunchale, where we worked. It's called the Huasteca. And the Nahuatl and the Huasteco Indians live in that area. And they were determined to apply these indigenous principles. To them, they were unproven. But they believed that they would work. And so they would go into these small villages that had no churches, and they would begin to preach the gospel, and people would get saved, and they would begin to meet in small meetings, determined not to give them any financial inducement, not to provide food and clothing, not to build any buildings, not to pay the pastors. They wanted the people themselves to learn to trust the Lord to provide for their needs. And as they began to do that, they saw churches that were growing stronger and stronger. These churches were becoming, were no longer dependent on them. They could govern themselves. They were beginning to plant other churches out of these churches. And they saw that these indigenous principles were working. And out of that came our whole vision of world indigenous missions. And you'll learn later about our core values. One of our main core values are our indigenous principles that we'll talk about later. As I've been studying about the history of WIM, I'm seeing that God spoke to the leaders through visions, through dreams and visions. Myron had a vision of fires spreading all over the mountains of Mexico. And as he sought the Lord, what did that mean? And the Lord showed him that it was the Holy Spirit moving throughout Mexico. And they would go about into these areas and preach the gospel. After about 3 years of work, this small group of men had preached in over 30 villages. Many people had been saved, and a good number of churches were established. And they found that the national Christians who were empowered by the Holy Spirit, they were raised up and they were taking ownership of their own churches. And they saw that these indigenous principles really did work. In the spring of 1971, Myron and Paul and some of the others began to hold services for all the churches so they could come together in one big group and have a time of fellowship and have a time of teaching. And they used those times to train leaders. Soon that developed into an twice a month they would come together and train leaders who would then train others. Paul Kohler was in a meeting, and a young man from the United States came down to Mexico and shared a dream that he had. And in his dream, he said he saw a large volcano erupt, and some of the rocks and lava would roll down the bottom of the mountain and stay in that area. Other parts were being flung into the atmosphere, and it was scattered all over the world. See, at this time we were only in Mexico, and this gave them hope that God was going to take them and scatter them all over the world to spread the gospel. Just as Paul was listening to that prophecy or that dream, he saw himself above the earth looking down on the subcontinent of India. And he just felt that someday he would be in India. It took 30 years, but about 30 years later, he ended up in India developing a ministry called storying. Have any of you heard of storying? Yes. Well, basically what it is you train people. Most of these people do not read to learn. They either cannot read or when they do read, they don't read for pleasure, or they don't read to learn. They would just read a highway sign or read a letter if they had to read a letter or something. And so they are not accustomed to reading the scriptures. So in storying, what you simply do is teach them Bible stories. And they in turn, in fact, I've heard they've learned hundreds of Bible stories, over 100 Bible stories. They'll in turn take those Bible stories to other villages and tell those Bible stories. And there are reports of some of them telling a Bible story about a crippled man being healed, about Jesus when he walked in and healed the cripple or healed the blind. They'll take that story and go and share it in another village in India. God will move, and people who are blind, people who are crippled will get up and receive their healing just simply by telling the story. And God's used Paul. Paul is still working in India today, and has used him and his wife to start really hundreds of churches through these different people. So that prophecy came to pass, and we're so thankful for that. And we're thankful how God used visions and dreams to speak to these brothers and to lead them. So yes, indeed, they found out that indigenous principles certainly did work. And that desire to train and plant churches and to evangelize people, it grew and grew, and from that, World Indigenous Missions was developed. So during these 30 years, WIM missionaries have lived or worked in about 40 countries. We've had over 300 missionaries to come through WIM, and thousands of people have heard the gospel because of these missionaries. Hundreds of churches have been planted, and many leaders have been trained. We really appreciate you all coming and hearing about WIM, hearing about our vision, hearing about our mission, our core values, and really just allowing the Lord to speak to your heart and to show you what He wants you to do. And we'll be praying for you this week, that you will hear God and you will know what God is leading and speaking to you about. So we thank you for coming. I pray you will be a part of this history that continues to move forward, called World Indigenous Missions.